First of all, I want to thank the Academy for this tremendous honor. When you look at the list of previous individuals who received this award, it's a pretty humbling experience to put yourself in the same group, or try to. Secondly, I want to thank the previous two speakers who were just terrific. Janine, first of all, illustrates why I love genetic counselors. It's harder to become a genetic counselor than to get into medical school. And the level of ability was, I think, pretty evident. The other thing I learned from your talk is that I thought that Japanese and Spanish were the world's fastest spoken languages, but you're in a class of your own. So I'm going to seem like I've got hypothyroidism by comparison. Dr. Lomander, Cy was a dear friend. We were inaugural scientific directors of CIHR together, and really good friends, and a wonderful human being. And you elicited all kinds of fond memories of a terrific individual. And as I mentioned to you, as you passed the table, I'd like to be your patient. So my subject, as the title indicates, is the relationship between the Academy and CIHR. And I have a preemptive apologia, which is that my adult children called me the world's most annoying man. But and I'm saying that because I spent a lot of time over the summer learning about the Academy, and I think I probably nearly drove Alison Hardesty to distraction with phone calls and requests for information, and Paul Armstrong and Carl Herbert. And there's still a lot to learn. It's actually one superficial impression is it takes a great deal of effort to try to understand this organization and what it should be doing, what it's done to date, what resources it needs, and so on. So Paul was the first president of the Academy, and I dug around and called surreptitiously, unbeknownst to him, some friends and colleagues. And one of the uniform things was that people regarded him as a visionary leader, highly focused, ambitious, very ambitious, aims very high, and sticks with it, whatever, and he's not retiring in either as in personality or in his career. Paul was the founding director of VIGOR, which is the Virtual Coordination Center for Global Collaborative Cardiovascular Health, a clinical trial-focused organization for improving that disease, and somehow manages to do everything he's done before and still be, quotes, retired. So I wanted to get a sense from Carol when I got this nice letter from her about being acknowledged through this award. I phoned her and I said, what do you think I should talk about, and what should I say? And she said, well, the one thing we wanted to do is thank you for your contributions to CIHR and stabilizing health research. There's an important fact check, is that this was a very complicated business. It was 15 months, finished in June 2017. I went to Nova Scotia to our place beside the ocean for 2 months and was horizontal. It was exhausting, but it was entirely the result of a great team effort. And this team consisted, first of all, and most amazingly, of the ineffable, irrepressible Anne Martin Matthews, who had a much tougher job than me in that she had to come from BC and fly this endless trip and go back, whereas I took a train to Montreal for an hour and 45 minutes on Thursday evenings and came back on Sunday. But Anne and I were also fellow scientific directors together, and when I was offered this position, and I realized we needed a new VP research, she was the first person that occurred to me, and it didn't take much, thank God, persuasion to attract her to take the role. This is typical Anne. She's one of the most enthusiastic people on earth, and she's getting some kind of something here at the University of Waterloo last year. The other major contributors were the 13 scientific directors. So when I came, their role had been diminished within CIHR, and they felt disenfranchised, whereas when I and the people prior to the 2017 or 2010, those directors felt like, they had a huge role in making the major decisions about CIHR, what things to do, how to spend the money, how to relate to the research community like you. And these are a wonderful group, just exceptional individuals. Now, not all of them were people I worked with, because Anne and I participated in the hiring of 5 of them in the short period we were at CIHR. And that was fun, because these are all those who are new players are also terrific. The other key, there's 3 other key individuals. First is Michele Peres, who after I got to know him for 2 months, it was obvious that he should be the executive vice president, and he continues to be brilliant in that role. And just one of the he's become a dear friend, an exceptionally able individual. The second person whose abilities became apparent very quickly is Adrian Mota, who's a very young man, as you can tell by his face, who's now the associate VP for research. And he's a brilliant man who, if I asked him, okay, what do you think we should do with the grant review process? And he'd come back in a day or two, because he'd thought about it forever, and say, here's what we should do, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we just never disagreed with him. So CIHR in his hands, and the role he has is in good hands. Another key individual is Paul Koobs. So there is this entity called the College Chair, the College of Reviewers, and they're they were being overseen in principle by the chair, by these college chairs, about 13 of them. And so I went to the first meeting after I'd been there about 3 weeks of their first meeting. They meet 3 or 4 times a year to see what they were actually doing. And it wasn't actually clear. They were just talking about the review process and the concerns. And it was clear that they were the people who should be overseeing the peer review process. And I whispered at Paul after about an hour and a half during the coffee break at that first meeting, don't you think this should be your role? And he embraced it, and the whole group of college chairs embraced it, and they remain their major responsibility is advising CIHR on peer review decisions. So whenever we suits had a thought about peer review, we went to the college chairs and what did they think, and they edited, they excluded, they were just, Paul is an amazing guy. He's also a completely outstanding scientist, as you may know. So I think the historical view of CIHR on the part of the community is this, that it's a source of money, and its only role should be giving those dollars to the research community to do their thing. And I think this is a dialogue that we need to try to reset, just like we're trying to, Dr. Lomander wants to reset the view of osteo. This is something that needs to be changed. And the change is that the academy needs to, and the community, as represented by the leaders of the community, which are you and the other fellows of CIHR, needs to think about how it can contribute to CIHR. And one of the comments after Dr. Lomander's talk was about, the Academy could have taken on a couple of the issues that he raised. And so when I thought about this, there's 2 ways that the Academy can contribute through the fellows as individual researchers who are respected leaders in their field, and then also as a body, which is, so what should the fellows do? They must participate in CIHR and motivate colleagues to contribute also. I mean, why? Well, if anybody's going to listen to the research community, they're going to listen to you. You know, the tweets and letters to the minister and letters to the president will have nothing like the impact if you had a voice and interacting with them and trying to change things. And everybody I talk to about shouldn't this be the case, or first of all, dozens of people said this to me. You know, I said, what do you think about the role of the Academy with respect to CHR? They said, well, you know, they're the most respected people in the country. They should be guiding the rest of us. So on the individual level, most fellows, too many fellows, I mean, the vast majority perhaps, if you ask them to participate in a peer review panel, they say, well, I did that for 15 years, 20 years ago, and I've done my thing, and now I'm too busy. And I think that's something that we should try to reset. I mean, you may not want to do it, understandably, because you don't feel you're up to speed anymore in the field. That's perfectly legit. But if you're asked to be on a panel, and I heard this story over and over, many of the most respected scientists, many fellows, were asked to be on panels when I was there, and they just, you know, declined. So I think this is a very serious responsibility. And the other thing you can do is entice other experienced scientists for the very same reasons, to accept these requests, these invitations. A smaller but important point is I don't know how many of your institutions have obligatory internal grant reviews, but at SickKids, these were brought in about 35 years ago by Asia Rothstein, and they just transformed the place. And I've taken this to my institution, and it's a culture builder. It improves grants, and you learn about your colleagues' research in a way you would never normally learn just by hearing them give a talk, actually. So this is a way of spreading the culture of the benefits of peer review, really. So, one thing I didn't want to do, and when I wrestled with the risk of seeming to speak for CIHR when I'm no longer thank God, the president of CIHR. So I phoned Mike, and we had nice little chats, and I said, look, why don't you send me your thoughts about, some of your major thoughts about what should be going on. And so he reinforced what I've just been saying about participating in CIHR with this sentence by saying anyone funded by CIHR should be willing, if asked, to be on a panel. Maybe you're not in the game anymore, whatever, so you may not be asked, but I get really distressed when I hear of a fellow who was asked to be on a panel and is no longer the president of University of Toronto or whatever it is, and declines. But even more distressing are people who are more maybe in the mid-career who are they're going to be fellows. They're fantastic researchers, and they're declining. I mean, that's just appalling. So I think as the leaders of your institutions across the country, it's important that we all try to work to change this. So what else could the individual fellows do? It wasn't hard. Well, I don't know. If you're a scientific director, you walk into the game, and it's sort of up to you to decide who to choose as your institute advisory board members, and that's fine. But there's two systems by which that happens. The first is, people can submit letters. There's a glass of water there. People can submit, their own names, which, as you can imagine, with situations like that, doesn't usually bring out the most of the people you want. Sometimes it does, and people you might. Thank you very much, my McGill colleague. So that's mode one. The second is, and what's most frequently employed is the director, the new director, phones up an individual he knows would be good. But the menu could be expanded by you, by CIHR, by Academy members, by writing to the director and saying, look, in my field, just for your information, these individuals would be really good. That's a doesn't sound like much work, and there's no way you can know, even in this, I hadn't met Janine before that I recall. I thought I knew every research geneticist in the country. There's no way you can know everybody, even in Canada, in your field completely. So the second is that I mentioned that Ann and I were involved in appointing 5 new scientific directors. I had to, for some institutes, make a lot of phone calls and sort of twist some arms to get people to apply and be interested. And it's absolutely a terrific, important job, and it's really unfortunate. So, understandably, there are some individuals who are just on the absolute peak and the acme of their career, and they really are busy, and let's say they're 55 years old, and they probably feel they have 5 years of being at the top left. So they're declined at that time. The other thing is you can apply to be on governing council. The government solicits your applications. Now, these choices of who's on governing council are made by the Ministry of Health and essentially by the deputy minister. But if you don't apply, you won't get there. And the current governing council is superb. It's just the kind of individuals you want. So, and join other CIHR bodies like the university delegates, which have important roles. So the Academy as a resource, what might it be doing? Well, it, of course, contributes through these marvelous assessments, which I read several with great interest. And I asked Mike and 8 scientific directors to suggest things to CIH, that the Academy, sorry, I got this is wrong, to CIHR it should be, that would benefit the president, and you could write to Mike or write to a scientific director or to the Institute advisory boards. And I think this is really important because, again, each of us can't know all the community. So, and Mike in his letter to me, I tried not to be replicating what he was saying, but we both had this same perspective, is that the academic healthcare sector must be more active and engaged in the vitality of the community and its processes, not just be open recipients of CIHR funds. So one of the things he specifically mentioned as a potential focus for the Academy is this, something we're all familiar with, is retirement of senior researchers. This is a ethically thorny, culturally difficult thing. Some countries are addressing it very wisely. Of course, the Europeans have it down. They just say you have to retire at the age of 65 in general. But I think this needs to be looked at because you don't have to send the person out on the street. There's other strategies, but ask them to release some of their funds. Maybe they can retire and not decrease their salary much, but their salary's coming from their pension significantly. So. And there's other financing. This is something that needs really careful thought, and I agree with Mike on that. The second is I had the honor of, frankly, of participating in this panel on team science, and this is a really great document if you haven't read it, and I can say that without chest thumping because I was responsible for a very small perspective of it. But then we don't know what the uptake of this has been by panels, by universities, even within CIHR. And Mike and I were both realizing this. Have the panels given credit to, say, a leading statistician? There's some in genetics in Canada. There's some world-leading statisticians at my institution, and they're middle authors generally because they're facilitators. And they have a hard time getting grants. They have a hard time getting promoted. So one of the foci of this document was that these sort of middle people who are just as good scientists as the people who are the first or last authors, but in a different facilitatory role, need to be recognized. How do we do that more? So there's lots of suggestions in here about how to do that. So I asked the scientific directors, what kind of contributions the Academy could make to CIHR. And this was really, I asked 8 of them that I could get, and they had about 2 weeks to respond. And some of the responses were fantastic. There were about 2 or 3 dozen. And obviously you can only spend a couple of minutes now alluding to some of them, but I will send to Paul and the board, if these directors permit me to share their comments with you, material that I think you'd find really interesting. So here's one of course I had a special interest in genetics, which is led by Chris McMaster of Dalhousie. He reminds us that about 25% of the human genomes are sequenced of human genomes as part of clinical care, okay? And this is expected to increase to 80% by 2022. So that's nice to know, okay. That's good for all kinds of reasons, because you get understanding of the disease, and as Janine said, this is right now largely for monogenic disorders, because we understand exactly what's going on. But Chris pointed out that as omics, proteomics, genomics, anything you can think of enters clinical care more and more, and these things will, genomes will become part of a patient's record. Genetic disease and cancer are the main foci of these processes right now, but it'll cover every patient, I think, in a very short time. It's going to cost about $100 to do a genome sequence very quickly, and after that it might be even less. So Chris's point was that for research, however, large-scale analysis of genomes can benefit all of us, the country, through the social contract, using AI, deep learning, etc. But this research has led to REB fatigue. And so there's a challenge to you. How can this be alleviated? And he talks about things like, instead of having to apply in all provinces and territories to a different ethics board, this is an old theme, but it needs to be solved. It's completely disadvantageous. Even in the States, it's often better arranged than we're able to do it in this supposedly, in that social sense, superior country. So Sam Weiss, is the director of neuroscience, etc., pointed out, and a lot of these directors had similar comments. Canada has been slow to adopt digital health. The rest of the world is hurtling forward. We need to understand where and when and how we can catch up, and for example, using our competitive advantage in AI to lead the world in some component of digital health. This is a really important focus that the Academy could contribute to. Cihr Koshik, who's one of the new scientific directors, as Chris all 3 of those individuals are pretty new, but Cihr and Chris were appointed by Anna and I during our term, I should say. I shouldn't use the possessive. So Cihr noticed that during the current, CIHR has been recently undergoing a strategic planning process, what they should do over the next 5 years. She said, I have not seen the Academy feature anywhere in the consultations. They should have been one of the first organizations on the list of stakeholders. So that's not necessarily Mike Strong's negligence. It's because if you don't assert yourselves, he's a busy guy. He's not going to necessarily think, and no prior president has done that. We need to do that. And now I'm talking we, using as a member of the Academy. So there's these other examples I'll send to you all, but there's a few teasers, let me say, that I think are really good and thoughtful ideas. So one of the tricky things about the Academy is who can advocate for it? And this is where discussions with Paul Armstrong and others were very helpful. The mission in the nice history of the Academy that Paul and John Cairns wrote is to provide a voice, or it's summarized here, to provide a voice for the health scientists in Canada and to provide expert assessments on key issues. Okay, well, if you're going to provide, so let's deal with the what CIHR is. Well, it's these 4 pillars, as you know, and they have this complex relationship to each other, but I am actually a basic scientist. I fully believe what Lauren Terrell, somebody we all admire, has said here, that biomedical research transforms healthcare. And there's an increasing number of articles in the major journals and increasing recognition this is the case, and I'm going to give you one example that may have one of the biggest impacts that we've heard in a long time. So it's not to say this is more important, but that's where the fountain is. And so I looked at the CIHR Open program, the distribution of biomedical scientists, Pillar 1 scientists, and compared to the other pillars. And I didn't look at it, the CIHR did it for me, and you can see the majority are Pillar 1. Now, I'm not saying for 2 seconds there should be some proportionality between the composition of fellows at the Academy and the research community, but it's something to think about. And so there wasn't data on this. I phoned up Allison and I said, how many fellows are in Pillar 1? And the data doesn't exist, so my lab and I spent some time on the internet with the list of fellows that we were given. And we surveyed about 89% of younger fellows and 35% of more senior fellows. About 40% are look to be Pillar 1, and about half more senior. So that's pretty good. The other pillars are therefore whatever you subtract. So again, I want to emphasize that doesn't mean there should be some proportionality, but I think there's with CIHRs, most of its money going to Pillar 1. You should be concerned, even if you aren't a Pillar 1 scientist, and almost half of you are, whether that's being used in the best way. So I just wanted, just remind us all about what the benefits of basic research are. So some impacts of genomic research, which I'm very familiar with, are on disease and risk gene discovery, and then clinical application. And for rare diseases, you get a diagnosis, you save money, the family knows what's going on, they don't spend years on an odyssey looking for something that doesn't exist. It's leading to developments for some diseases, and of course it facilitates family planning. For common diseases, we can now generate polygenic risk scores, which are accounting for, in some diseases, up to half of the total heritability. And so the disease is not necessarily just environmental. And that's the beginning of the pathway to precision treatment. I was actually astounded by Janine's reminding us what Victor Zhao said, because he's usually a very moderate, careful in his language. And that's I agree, that was a big overstatement. I think eventually what he said may be true, but it's not going to be in a little while. So the Institute of Genetics, when I was the head of it, and worked with Maurice Barrer to support health services for all this new information that was coming forward. For example, how do the healthcare professionals take up, how do they counsel people, how do they advise policymakers about what we should be done with this new information? And I think that's an ongoing and expanding problem. The other thing is that the field of genetic epidemiology, and again, Janine sort of alluded to this in her, I like your jar image. All disease is an interplay between environmental factors and genes, but you couldn't get near there was nothing to do about the genes until the Genome Project. So this field of genetic epidemiology didn't exist prior to the Genome Project. And when I realized, I thought this, gee, is that true? And I phoned up people and leaders in the field, and they said, absolutely. So there was a tiny bit, but you couldn't, it was all sort of more theory than actually reality. And genetic epidemiology is important for knowing, actually what's going on is to cause a disorder. So one of the Canadian basic research stars is Kim Boycott at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario on rare diseases. And it's important to find the genes involved in rare diseases for the reasons I said. They're hugely costly to treat, even if there is a treatment. If there's a personal cost that's huge, even if you can't treat them, for the family, for the medical care system, wasting time on incorrect diagnoses and so on. So the Canadian, Kim has led these 3 networks on rare diseases in Canada. And they've studied 264 different rare diseases, found the genes in 146, which is pretty damn good, considering that nothing was known about what was going on. And those are pretty typical of the worldwide figures. And 67 genes whose role was not understood in biology have been identified, and so on. So she's a real star who's contributing in a really important area. My last basic science thing that I'm going to talk about is, this is a paper you'll want to read, unless the idea of looking at thinking about glycolysis almost makes you ill. But this was actually featured on the BBC News, which I heard about it. But Michael Welch is one of the U.S.'s most respected basic scientists, and he's a good friend of mine. I didn't know this work. He was doing this work. He'd previously worked on cystic fibrosis, but he's a very prudent scientist. And so when I read that he'd done this work, and he's optimistic about its potential for the treatment of Parkinson's, and I'll tell you why in a second, I thought this might really have legs. So I don't know. I mean, even the most sober scientists get overexcited about what they're doing, but I don't think that's the case here. So what's going on? So the basic conclusion is, if you increase ATP production, you slow the progression of the disease, and in some cases even prevent it. That's a pretty stunning possibility. So what's the evidence? So there's well-documented evidence that affected neurons produce less ATP, okay? And there's a drug, terazosin, which is Hytrin, which is approved for probably a significant number of the men in this audience over the age of 50 are taking it for benign prostatic hypertrophy. And it increases cellular ATP levels, and it's very well tolerated. So in mouse models, what Mike and his colleagues did was look at all these animal models, including pluripotent stem cells in a dish from human, and to see whether what the drug did in brain ATP levels, and it slowed it, and in those models it slowed or prevented neuronal loss. Then they went to human databases and found that the drug, there was evidence from comparing people on the drug with the risk of Parkinson's with those who had never heard of it. And it looks like it slowed the disease progression, decreased complications, reduced the diagnostic frequency. In other words, they didn't get the disease yet in those subjects taking it. So this is a drug that's you could use off-label for treating this disease. Not suggesting for a second you should. There's a huge clinical trial that's being put together to look at this more carefully. But the idea of being able to have a biochemical primary impact on this disease is pretty stunning. So, okay, can the Academy be an advocate? So I will just go up. If it's yellow, does that mean I'm over time already? Okay. So many people I talk to, including half at least of the scientific director, said to me, why doesn't the Academy advocate for research with the government and anybody else? And I grilled a lot of fellows and senior leaders on this particular point. And why should they? First of all, well, they have the great credibility and stature I've mentioned, and no other national organization, if there is one, tell me. It's not the Royal Society. They're not medical. They're, looking for excellence in science. So no other national organization is well placed to advocate with the same authority. So why not? So Paul, either in one of the things you wrote or when we talked, there's a history of the view, not just from Paul, but from the Academy leaders in general, that the Academy occupies neutral space evaluates best evidence and does not advocate for anything other than general health of Canadians. So that's true. Similarly, the U.S. National Academies can't do anything that might be seen as partisan. This statement's a little different from this. Okay, that's not unreasonable, but it does limit their influence at times. This is a National Academy member. I talked to several members. This is a typical statement from them. So then I said, well, okay, what's the funding of the National Academy? If our Academy feels uncomfortable asking the Government of Canada for increased funding for CIHR, what does the U.S. National Academy do? Well, 85% of their funding comes from their federal government, but it comes through contracts and grants from agencies, and 15% comes from state governments, other sources, okay? And funds provided by the academies by member organizations. So I don't know how many deans are in the room, but take note of that statement. So these are some of the challenges from the community's perspective that the Academy could address, and some of the challenges the Academy faces in trying to address them. And I want to acknowledge the tremendous help that Allison was. She's a source of endless information and enthusiasm, and I was most grateful for her assistance. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rod. We do have time for one or two questions before we break. Jean, please.
Hi, Rod. I'm going to be a thorn in your side again.
Well, I was a thorn in your side when I was on the team science panel. Jean invited me, and every time there was an issue, I phoned her up. So.
And the phone rang a lot. I'm concerned about the care and feeding of the volunteers who do all of this work on behalf of CIHR. And I'm going to hark back a little bit to the beginning of CIHR, and Dot will, I hope, be able to sustain this discussion. The two of us were inaugural chairs of Institute advisory boards. There was virtually no, and I would say as much as negative communication from central office. There was no communication between the IABs. So I set up a listserv of the IAB chairs just so that we could chat with one another. That raised concerns at CIHR that we were having, quote, rebellious discussions. And they then insisted that we had to use their listserv, but in fact, they never got it set up. So we then asked if we could actually have a meeting with Alan Bernstein, because it was a tremendous amount of work on behalf of the IABs you will remember that, at that time, because everything had to be set up from scratch. We were informed that we could have 1 hour on very short notice.
You could have one what?
1 hour of Alan's time on very short notice. So we all, about 2/3 of us, am I right, Doc? Oh, she's not here anymore. There were about 2/3 of us actually managed to make it to the meeting. And Alan got such an earful that he stayed for 8 hours instead of the one that he had promised us. And it was very productive discussion, but I think it was the first time it had dawned on him that the 180 people who sat at IABs were spending a tremendous amount of time doing work on behalf of CIHR with no recognition whatsoever. So my question to you is there an improved attention to the needs of the people who volunteer for CIHR?
Well, I thought you were, so I don't know the answer to that. I think that people are proud to be an IAB member, Institute Advisory Board member, and I think that's the feedback. It's the same as with any other service provided by an academic. But I thought you were leading up to a different topic, which many people suggested to me and occurred to me, and I think maybe Mike, which was that there needs to be a regular dialogue and interaction between the two organizations, and how might that be achieved without being invasive? And I think that needs deep thought. I mean, we could all come up with some quick thoughts, but you want the CIHR new directions every time it turns over to make the decisions they want to make, but I think it should know what the Academy, what the leaders of our research community are thinking. So, yeah.
One of the dilemmas was that some of the IABs were actually management boards, some were advisory boards, some met regularly, some didn't meet at all, and there was no guidance as to what the process was supposed to be. And that was the first thing that initiated my need to create a listserv across the country so that we at least understand what our roles were.
So I love this point. So a lot of the advisory boards still, it's pretty laissez-faire. And a lot of them the members do a lot of work for the Institute. That is not what I did with the Institute of Genetics. I picked a whole bunch of high flyers who we sent documents to, and their work was getting to the meeting, reading some summary decision-based documents that would help the Institute make decisions before they came to the IAB meeting, and that would be twice a year. Maybe for some more. And so because it was a minimal invasion of their time, but an important role, Janet Rossett and Tom Hudson, I had fabulous people. And some of the boards are like that, and other ones are still the model where they're in, I think there's a confusion between governance and oversight and management. I agree. This is maybe a point you can make it in a more formal way. Yeah.
I don't see a conflict between advocating for research and advocating for the health of Canadians. I think they're synonymous. So I don't see any reason that the Academy shouldn't be advocating for research.
Well, I agree, but I didn't want to be the world's most annoying man like my children call me.
One final question, Kathy.
I have the mic? Judy Ellis at UBC. Rod, thank you so much for your efforts, and thanks to Anne and everyone who pulled us going forward now. Canada is one of the few countries of more than 100 that doesn't have a national ethics commission that's largely focused on health. So in full disclosure, I have a relationship with the Standing Committee on Ethics for CIHR. But I wonder if you could share any thoughts you might have on a national ethics commission for Canada as a joint project between CIHR and the Canadian Academy for Health Sciences.
So during my term, I stayed away from that because there were just more mechanical, spirit-raising things to deal with. But this is an issue that came up often from people in your community and others. And Chris McMaster brought it up again. It's impeding research, the fact there isn't a national body, and I think that would be a major useful assessment for the Academy to undertake to share with CIHR. So.
Final question, Kathy.
Rod, thank you. I agree. There should be a close relationship between our Academy and CIHR. But the real question is, what does that look like in terms of the relationship? You talked about communication with directors and so on, but if there's going to be a relationship, it needs to be structured and there needs to be a set of goals and objectives that both parties agree to. So in your view, what would the relationship look like?
So, at first it has to be just totally only advisory. Secondly, I agree, that's a delicate, complex thing. The first thing is it has to be clearly just advisory, and both parties have to understand that. And the risk being that people or the directors or the president might think that the Academy is trying to take it over. So so I wasn't going to bring this up for the reasons you say until about 5 of the directors suggested that this was needed to me. So I think it's something that the Academy and CIHR needs to have a dialogue about and to address the very issues you're seeing. And how can you have you're the only body in the country that has, I say, the authority and knowledge and respect from the community and outsiders. If the Ministry of Health and the Prime Minister doesn't respect you, and the Chief Scientific Officer like Mona, which I know she does, then we're lost. So I think that you need to open the door there and maybe approach Mike or, I can't remember whether that was one of the things he suggested, but certainly in general, he was saying there needs to be a good relationship. So it's tricky. It has to be sensitive, but I think if you sort of decide, I don't think,